Hello, and welcome to the ALN 2020 Asset Leadership Forum, Restructuring America. I'm Nick Kanoki, the Director of Technology for the Asset Leadership Network, and I'm very excited to be starting off today, our last day of the 2020 Asset Leadership Forum, with this panel and event, The Path Forward with Asset Leadership. Two notes before we get started. We have been getting interest in the ALN approach to asset leadership and asset management. So I just wanted to take a moment to let all of you panelists and attendees know that we do have a 2-week web course leading to ALN A55K professional certification starting on November 9th. So you can see our website, assetleadership.net, for more information on that. And now without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Jack Kelly, ALN Senior Fellow and formerly with the OMB for 36 years. Jack?
Thanks, Nick. So it's my privilege today to introduce Peter Kohler, but before I introduce Peter, I need to tell you a story about how I actually met Peter. Michael Hardy and Michael will be moderating a panel following Peter's discussion. About 3 years ago, we started on a white paper looking at the history of asset management. And so, as any good researcher would do, I went to Google and I put in asset management, and up comes an article on infrastructure asset management that mentions a woman named Dr. Penny Burns in Australia as being one of the early leaders of asset management. So I went to LinkedIn and I found Dr. Burns, had a really nice conversation with her. She gave a lot of early history of her involvement with asset management. And then I said, well, so Dr. Burns, so what's going on in Australia today? She said, well, the person you have to talk to about that is Peter Kohler. Peter Kohler is like in the center of a lot of what's going on in Australia, and he's the best guy to talk to. So I reached out to Peter. We had a number of really interesting conversations, and Peter turned out to be a major contributor to the paper that Michael and I were writing. I mean, he in fact told me more about the history of the United States involvement or the evolution of asset management in the United States than I had learned from anybody in the United States, which was kind of interesting to me. But that's not the end of the story. At the end of the paper that Michael and I wrote, there was a section on where around the world was asset management being, or I should say ISO 55000 being implemented. And what was interesting there was that there were 4 countries that stood out: Japan, the Netherlands, Australia, and the UK. They had like 10 times more certified organizations than anybody else. So a year or so later, I got interested in following up on that and learned that I became actually fascinated with the question, what is it about these 4 countries that has caused this much greater adoption of ISO 55000? And that got me to take a closer look at those 4 countries, which brought me back to Australia. And so I shared a paper with Peter, and he gave me lots of great information. And then about a year ago, I learned about the national infrastructure plan for Australia, and then subsequently a state, the New South Wales infrastructure plan. And I thought, oh my God, a national infrastructure plan is what the United States desperately needs, but we're not. We're just not set up to do that. So yet. Now, that's one of the things that the National Asset Leadership Strategy is trying to work toward, but we're not there. We hope we're on a good path. But anyway, I thought, well, the best person to talk about why Australia is where it is Peter Kohler. He was in the middle of a lot of why it is where it is today. And so with that, I would like to introduce Peter Kohler and ask him to tell us more about this. Peter?
Well, thank you very much, Jack. Excuse me. I'm a little embarrassed, actually. I don't often get that way, but a little embarrassed with your introduction. But that aside, thank you very much for the opportunity and the Leadership Network, the opportunity to have a chat to everyone this morning. For me, I think for most people watching this presentation, it's a reasonable time of day. For me, it's 4 o'clock in the morning. I don't say that for any other reason that when I'm an engineer by background, and I spent many years in the Navy. And when I was training as an engineer in the Navy, you had to do a lot of watch keeping. And the worst watch to keep was the morning watch, which was 4 till 8 in the morning. So I congratulate the Asset Leadership Network in picking the worst time of day for me, from a number of emotional reasons, apart from the physical reason of being 4 o'clock in the morning too. That aside, I hope I can do the presentation justice. So let me talk my way through that, and I look forward to your questions and observations afterwards as well on completion. You can all see the title, I'm presuming, title slide, the development path to an integrated set of national and state infrastructure plans. Before I get into detail, I need to introduce myself a little.
Peter, we're not seeing the title slide.
You're not seeing the title slide?
Yes, we're not seeing the title slide. And if you give it one more try, then I can try it as well. Ah, there we go.
Is that better?
We're seeing it now. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for interrupting. Yep.
No problem.
Okay. Yes, so now you can see the title slide, and I'll go through the slides. The introducing myself a little bit more detail. It is relevant to the conversation. I don't normally talk about myself at the beginning, other than read the slide, but a few points about that. I'm a mechanical engineer by background. Joined the Navy from high school. Spent quite a few years in the Navy, and as I just alluded to, and that's where I started my asset management journey, actually. We perhaps talk about that later on, but I was actually, to be honest, quite professionally challenged by some of the things that were happening at the time in Navy, and I learned that I found out that I didn't know as much as I thought, and so I spent a lot of time learning about those things, and it all comes down to this subject and this discipline called asset management. I've been a certified fellow in asset management now for about 12 years. I'm in relation to the Asset Management Council, I am now the Executive Liaison Commissioner. My job is to get people talking. That's all. Get people, 2 or 3 groups of people, 2 or 3 people talking. I am the immediate past Body of Knowledge Commissioner. The word commissioner means you're commissioned on behalf of the board of the Asset Management Council to, and my job as a Body of Knowledge Commissioner was to approve all the technical content, through all the documentation and other things in relation to the discipline of asset management. As a result of that, I ended up being on the 251 ISO 251 Asset Management Committee, which set up the ISO standards, developed the ISO standards, and that's, of course, where I met Jim Dieter and lots of other people would have won as well. I am now a member of the International Electrotechnical Commission, Technical Committee number 56, Dependability. Dependability has about 67 standards. I'll repeat myself, 67 standards. Why do I think that's important? Because they're all the how-to standards. How do you do asset management? I'm going to talk a little about these things throughout the slide, or mention them. So it's actually relevant for me to introduce myself in the way that I just have. Okay. Introducing the Asset Management Council very briefly. It's a significant part of the background to the subject of setting up infrastructure plans within Australia. More about that shortly, of course, but the introducing the Asset Management Council, its vision is enabling benefits for all from the use of assets. It's quite interesting, the language here. You don't get benefit from assets, you get benefit from the use of assets. So the use of, we think, is very important, just that phrase, the use of assets. A bit of background about the council itself. It started out in life in 1992 as the Maintenance Engineering Society of Australia, and it was associated with the Institution of Engineers, the premier body within Australia that looked after engineering, or the discipline of engineering. In 2004, it transformed itself into the Asset Management Council. Another story for another day of why and how, but it was unanimous change. The leadership and the membership we're all keen to make that change. We're a member-based, industry-funded, registered, not-for-profit professional association, independent by constitution. You can read the rest of the slide there. We are still a technical society of the Engineers Australia, although that relationship is a bit loose now. We are able to act independently. And importantly, for our presentation this morning too, my presentation this morning too, the Asset Management Council is industry agnostic. There are many organisations asset management focused organisations, which are focused on particular industries. We, as a council, are industry agnostic. So we say all our approaches apply to every industry within Australia and of course elsewhere as well. Our mission is to create broad awareness, nurture a common understanding of asset management, and provide a portal to asset management knowledge and resources. Okay, that's a quick introduction in terms of what it is we do. The sorts of things that the Asset Management Council, a bit more detail about the Asset Management Council. You can read the slide here in terms of membership and income. What I really want to highlight in this slide is industry. Since changing from the Maintenance Engineering Society to the Asset Management Council, what is really interesting to us is that well over 200 commercial and government organisations have a relationship, either commercial or work in kind, with the Asset Management Council. One of the things we try and do is engage with organisations. We're not just after sponsorship. We actually want to work together to create things that will improve our membership. Our goal is always to help our members understand and apply asset management really well. So we're always looking for partnerships to do work together. Yeah, and that's why the phrase, when we talk about nationally, how do we work together? We work together with all other Australian asset management focused organisations, and here are just some. Most of you won't understand the acronyms. It really doesn't matter for the time being, other than for me to say that the IPWEA is a municipal organisation that focuses on councils, municipal councils, the engineering side of that. Ausroads is, I think, what it says, or looking after all the national roads, and they have affiliations, of course, with all the states in Australia in terms of maintaining and operating roads. The WASA the WASA and the WSA are water organisations, look after water nationally in Australia. One collects the water and the other one distributes. So I'm not going to get into detail, but my point is that our goal is to work with all these other organisations, and you'll hear this over and over again in our presentation today. My presentation today is about working with people. Internationally, we're certainly involved in ISO. There are quite a number. We make a point of working in the ISO community, not just on 251. 251, of course, just to repeat, is about the ISO 55000 standard. We do have other people working on systems engineering and other aspects of ISO. We do have a team working with the IEC, as I mentioned before. I'm there, but there's others as well, particularly Technical Committee 56. There are other IEC domains, committees which we have members working on. Risk is one, ISO 31000, and a couple of others. We're certainly involved in the Global Forum on Maintenance and Asset Management, as I'm sure most of you online would know. On a personal note, I was the representative from the Asset Management Council that attended the meeting in London, as it turned out, for the creation of the Global Forum. Another interesting story, why that came about, interesting story for some other time, not today. In terms of international working with other groups, you can just see some of the flavour there of what the Asset Management Council does. A focus for today, of course, is on this, and the slide, you can all see the slide now. This is Australia's national infrastructure plan. It was published in 2016. And along the bottom of the slide now, you can see the preface there. You know, it sets out the infrastructure challenges and opportunities Australia faces over the next 15 years and the solutions required. And you can read the rest of that. I just wanted to say that I'm not surrounding this infrastructure plan is how does it happen? Well, it happened because there is a consensus from political parties, from many organisations around Australia. I mean, the input into a national infrastructure plan comes from many sources, from the private sector, from government sector, and so on. So this document represents a consensus view. The government, whilst the national government pays for this, it is overarchingly a consensus view. That doesn't mean that everything in the plan will actually happen. But however, it provides a guiding framework for national governments and state governments to work within. There's always going to be some challenges how things are done, but overarchingly behind all this is that consensus view. This national plan is actually supported by, as Jack Kelly said in the introduction, a number of state-based plans, and this is one. I'm not going to show you all of them. There are various states of degree of quality, I have to say, but the bigger states in Australia, which are Victoria and New South Wales, have put a lot of effort into it and use it, and all the governments, the state governments, use these things quite a lot to guide their decisions on where to spend money in relation to developing Australia. In other words, the infrastructure strategy. Here you can see that the front page of the the state of New South Wales, which is on the east coast of Australia, which includes where I am now in Sydney. And you can, if you read the bottom of this, the paragraph on the bottom, and you may or may not be able to read it, so because of the colouring, but I'll read it out to you. It says this 20-year strategy sets out Infrastructure New South Wales independent advice on the current state of New South Wales infrastructure and the needs and priorities over the next 20 years. So really there's quite a lot of interesting things that sentence talks about. Infrastructure New South Wales is a government agency. It's paid for by the government, yet it delivers independent advice to government. Once again, there's generally speaking consensus on their advice and this strategy and plan. I'm sure all of us can point to where various flavors of government might want to change a bit of emphasis, but overarchingly there is a consensus view on how these things are put together and the application of these strategies. These strategies include, quite obviously, many of the commercial aspects of Australia. So how do the ports work? How do the ports connect to all the other parts of Australia? How do they connect with all the transport agencies? All those sorts of things is all part of that infrastructure strategy. And I do want to say that allied with these plans has been a move in the last 15 years within governments in Australia to think a bit more broadly about things. When I was a young man, 20 years ago, and if you want to take a trip in Sydney, you'd actually using public transport, you'd go and maybe you should train or a bus or drive or a taxi, or sometimes even if you want to risk yourself 20 years ago, ride a bike. Nowadays, and they were all different agencies that essentially competed with everyone in the organisation, and it was very common 20 years ago for rail to compete with road and road to compete with rail and saw each other that way. Nowadays, that is not the case. All transport now comes under one cluster. And so there's an overarching structure given to the whole transport, the state of transport in all the states, most of the states in Australia. So there's been associated with the development of these infrastructure strategies and plans has been a move within government to realise that you shouldn't think of roads and rail as separate. You should think of them as a coordinated set of activities. You probably recognise that phrase, coordinated set of activities. Well, that comes from the definition of what is asset management from the ISO 55001 standard. So that's a bit of a background to these documents. I just want to say yet again that these are consensus-based, commercial, government. Everyone has a voice to play. Everyone has a voice in the development of these strategies. They're put together in this instance by Infrastructure New South Wales, an independent body to the government, even though it's paid for by the government. So its costs are borne by the New South Wales government. You can see on the left-hand side some of the things that the strategy addresses. And you can see asset management there. Asset management is a core activity of this plan. So asset management as a discipline needs to be the plan. One of the things that the strategy talks about is the application of asset management throughout all of government and throughout the private industry as well. So it sets the scene for the application of asset management as a discipline throughout much of Australia's infrastructure, and of course then leads on into all the businesses that support that, or indeed are supported by that. well, how did all that come about? And that sounds really nice. Maybe I'm gilding the lily too much. I'm sure some critics will say that about me in terms of what I say about those documents. But in general, what I said I believe is true. How did all that happen? Well, I go back to the 1980s and 1990s. Jack Kelly mentioned Dr. Penny Burns, and she's an economist by background. Many times I've thought about why it is that Australia, the same question that Jack was on about, why is Australia really actually quite okay relatively? Most of us would argue it needs a long way to go, but the relatively okay in terms of the application of asset management as a discipline. And I put it down to some of the things that happened in the 1980s and maybe before that Dr. Penny Burns was actually involved with, and others who are I don't know about, but certainly I know Penny Burns. And that the first one is the mandatory adoption of accrual accounting. I'm going to talk about some of these aspects a little later on. Accrual accounting and asset management are twins. Asset management and accrual accounting need each other to work, to be blunt, because they're philosophically aligned. As I've remarked there, accrual accounting, to me, remarkably, accrual accounting is not mandatory. Generally speaking, from a global perspective, accrual accounting is the way to go. But many organizations and countries still use cash accounting. Happy to have a chat about that later on. But for those organizations and those countries which have not yet adopted accrual accounting, asset managers are going to find it difficult to survive in that kind of environment and prosper in that kind of environment. So accrual accounting and all its implications, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes' time, very, very briefly, is one of the foundational elements of doing asset management really well, in my humble opinion. Equally, in the 1990s, to implement the accrual accounting, there's a number of international financial reporting standards and accounting standards that need to be applied, and these are made mandatory by the Australian Accounting Standards Board in around about those years. I've tried to find the exact years. I can't find it, but nevertheless, in terms of the story, 1980s, 1990s, accrual accounting became mandatory. To implement accrual accounting, excuse me, you need to apply the international financial reporting standards and apply particularly the accounting standards. We're going to talk in a few minutes briefly about some aspects of some of those because it's relevant to our discussions. You can't develop asset management plans, and you can't develop infrastructure plans if you actually don't think about combining technical and financial decision making. Yeah, and so this is the start of that journey. Yeah, this is the start of that journey. The activity timeline goes on. I've mentioned already that the Asset Management Council was established in 2004. One of the really important aspects of its development was what appears on the screen now. The very first thing we did, and this was not my idea, it was John Hardwick's idea, and I actually happy to say publicly, this is one of the best things that ever happened to the Asset Management Council. Yeah, don't let John hear me say that. Don't tell John I said that publicly. But it is in hindsight one of the best things we did. And we spent a number of years developing the culture. And the culture of the Asset Management Council you can see on the screen here. And I'm going to talk about this for a second. This is quite important. And I think the Asset Leadership Network will probably have the same realization if they haven't already. We needed to develop a culture. Every member of the Asset Management Council needed to be open and inclusive. If you're going to have an infrastructure plan that covers all of Australia, you're going to have to talk to everyone. And you're going to have a culture that's open and inclusive. And for many people, this issue was quite a challenge. Still, some people within the Asset Management Council are challenged by that. It seems kind of obvious that you need to. And you need to, certainly for many people like myself, need to keep continually focusing on and thinking about your own behaviors in terms of, am I being open? Am I being inclusive? You don't always act perhaps as you should, but nevertheless, everyone needs to be reflective of their own behaviors and ensure that next time we do it better. So being open and inclusive, a very important part of the Asset Management Council and a very important part of the achievement of those infrastructure plans. Thought leadership goes hand in hand with that. Thought leadership means you're seen as, and you actually are, a body that knows what they're talking about. Yeah, thought leadership. I'm going to talk a bit about that a bit more about that shortly. What does that mean? We made that a goal for ourselves to demonstrate thought leadership. So we were always going to be pursuing and learning. We're never going to rest on our laurels. There's always things to learn, and we're going to share that. Right. So if we're developing this an approach to thought leadership, we're going to share that because we're open and inclusive, and that leads to the next part of that, excuse me, that line where we share intellectual property that's freely available to all. There's really no point in being open and inclusive and thought leadership if you don't share your information. It's not about buying information. We're not in that game. We're in the business of saying you can use whatever we put together. We're actually putting it together to help everyone. Okay, to help everyone. All we ask is that you acknowledge where you got the information from. So intellectual property is freely shared, as a lot of you probably may be already aware. We act independently from the Institution of Engineers, and from a number of perspectives, strategically, we have a voice as well, which I'm going to talk about shortly. I don't really want to go into too much all the details, clearly, but there's some things that I think are really important to talk about. The roles of the Asset Management Council: promote awareness of the benefits, absolutely. Thought leadership, I've mentioned that already, but in detail, what that means for the Asset Management Council: we develop training and education courses on the why, what, and how of doing asset management. Those courses are very popular, still are. We developed the first courses in 2005, 2006. All of them were developed in-house by the teams, and that's a fantastic thing to do. We made a point of using our own expertise to put those things together, building up the involvement of the membership, building up the knowledge of the membership as well. And those courses, as I said to you, are still extremely popular. I deliver them. A number of others do as well, and I enjoy delivering those courses very much. And they're very much there are a number of courses, but essentially they're all about the why, what, and how. Why do you do asset management? What do you have to do it? And then how do you do all this stuff? So they're, as I said to you, very popular courses. We develop chapters around Australia to enable member involvement. It's not about numbers, it's about getting people engaged, as I said to you before. Open, inclusive thought leadership means you're continually trying to get your people engaged, continually trying to get them to think and improve the way they think about and apply this discipline of asset management. We encourage our membership to be on the front foot, which is a cricketing term. I know the Americans baseball is the game. Well, in Australia, it's cricket. And there's a cricketing term that's says being on the front foot. That means being aggressive, in the sense of assertive rather than aggressive. Being on the front foot means taking the challenge up. And don't be a victim again. It's a phrase we use often. And what we mean here is if you're a maintenance person or asset management person, as an example, someone, the chief financial officer comes and changes your budget, how should you react to that? How can you develop plans that enable you to deal with those sort of situations? And so to be able to respond by saying, well, if you can't change the budget, this is the impact. And so we teach people the tools and techniques of how not to be a victim again, and that goes hand in hand with the why, what, and how courses. And that's we don't use that language all the time. Don't be a victim again, but it's a phrase we often used internally to describe the environment that we're trying to solve, the challenge we give ourselves, and when we talk to our membership. Don't become a victim again, or don't become a victim. This is how you should deal with those situations. In order to do that, of course, you need to develop the why, what, and how. And of course, I mentioned the body of knowledge, which is a whole bunch of documents and not spreadsheets, documents and online stuff, the online information, and associated with that asset management competency scheme that's been out around about 12 years now. And a number of agencies around the world have adopted that. Associated with the competency scheme are all the competencies associated with this discipline of asset management, and we've identified, around about 720 individual competencies relevant to the discipline of asset management. So all that's part of the competency scheme. That was done some years ago. We make strategic commentary on things. There have been a number of legal cases associated with the discipline of asset management over the years, particularly 2014, 15, 16. And the AIM Council issued a number of press releases in relation to those. They're not used often, but we do make commentary from time to time. We certainly get involved in standards, development of standards. I already mentioned that. ASNZS, Australia and New Zealand, we tend to be a bit of a team these days, Australia and New Zealand, have been for a number of years. Even though there's some bitter rivalry between the two countries, globally we kind of act as one. So Australia and New Zealand standards, we get involved in those. As I haven't mentioned Australian and New Zealand standards before. I've mentioned ISO and I've mentioned the IEC, International Electrotechnical Commission, the AIM Council involvement. So those are the sorts of the roles the AIM Council sees for itself in order to deliver on our mission, our vision and mission. And all that was created in 2004. We also developed in 2004 a relationship with the IEM in the UK and Abraman in Brazil, and that seems on the face of it quite interesting. Brazil, and I ended up a number of us in the Asset Management Council took 6-month courses in speaking Portuguese. I did one of those. Don't ask me to speak Portuguese now, but in order to break down the language barrier, we had to walk towards the people you want to talk to. And so we actually did, a number of us did do courses at night in Portuguese, so to try and communicate better with our friends in Brazil, and that relationship still continues. Interestingly, again, we can have an interesting conversation about that possibly later on. SAP and IFM got involved with the AIM Council. I'm noticing the time, and that was they sought us out. SAP. IFM are 40% of Australia's superannuation are involved. 40% of Australia's superannuation is spent by IFM, and they're certainly involved with the Asset Management Council. Key members of the AIM Council are involved with Treasury, New South Wales and Victorian Treasuries. I was involved in that as well. Again, the involvement is not paid; it's actually pro bono. So helping Treasury and understand and deal with issues. That was quite a bit of work. A Fiscal Responsibility Act was produced in New South Wales, which is an interesting act. It makes the asset management a government discipline. Treasury is the policeman of that in terms of financials. Essentially, it says that as a government, we're going to do things and we're going to build new things. But if we build new things, we're going to be aware of how much they're going to cost over the next 20 to 30 years, and we have to make sure, in the Treasury's eyes, that we know where the money is going to come from for the whole of life, not just the acquisition, and so on. And in 2016, the infrastructure strategies and plans were created. So that's a bit of a background to the timeline. Some very quickly, because I notice I'm running out of time. The body of knowledge itself has a number of core themes. The only one I'm going to point out in terms of what comes up on the slide is to support the achievement of business needs. Asset management must integrate technical financial decision making. Going to make a bit more play about that in a few minutes, and very much that's when we created all the courses and all the documents and all the information about the why, what, and how of asset management. We made sure, as much as we could, that we demonstrated we could do that, integrate technical financial decision making. So those are some of the core themes of the body of knowledge. That you'll find information classified this way on our websites and other places, and all their documentation, a fair amount of documentation. I'm certainly not going to talk to the detail of all of these, but there's a whole bunch of technical references in the body of knowledge, and there's about, from memory, there's about 700 standards, technical references that we use to support the body of knowledge. Here is just some of them. Clearly, we're not going to show you all of them. I'm not going to talk to you about any of these things, but other than to point out that behind the body of knowledge is this kind of detail. Yeah. There are also, I mentioned, competencies. There's about 1,200 competencies associated with the process of asset management, and we do have documentation and information about the processes of asset management. We integrate that with all the international financial reporting standard requirements and the accounting standard requirements. As we say to all the people on the courses, you don't have to agree with the way the accountants think about life, but you do have to understand it. You do have to understand it. And so, naturally enough, the content of these accounting standards and financial reporting standards is part of our courses, and we encourage all our people to understand the content of these things and apply them in their business. If you're going to talk to a chief financial officer, you need to know the way they think, and this represents the way they think. Very important, very important. In terms of leadership and culture references, here are 4 or 5. There's a couple here that I've been involved in, particularly the first and the second, but I'd like to point out the Adaptive Enterprise document. That is a fantastic book to read. That's all about how do you create organizations that are adaptive? How can they change quickly? What kind of leadership style and culture is needed to support that? So there's lots of good references around these days in relation to leadership and culture. And very much, if you need to get people, what I call the space between the ears, you need to get the space between the ears aligned from everyone. So that relates to culture. How do people think? In conclusion then, that's a lot of interesting information. The journey itself started with, and I emphasize this yet again, that the journey of developing infrastructure plans, developing any asset management plans within a company, that's no different to this journey as well, to be honest. The first thing is about developing a collaborative, inclusive culture. Yeah, everyone's got to believe in that. It only takes 1 or 2 people who don't believe in it to challenge that very much. So it's very important that you keep a very close eye on the culture that you develop and maintain that, I guess, a bit of a discipline about assuring yourself that the culture is continuing to be collaborative, inclusive. And inclusive means you walk towards people, not away. You walk towards people, you engage with people. And to support the achievement of business and national needs, asset management must integrate technical and financial decision-making. I've mentioned that already, and part of that is how to do that. Not only do we need to do that, but we need to demonstrate to people how that's done. And the body of knowledge does that. Not just our body of knowledge, but also the other organizations that I've alluded to in Australia with an asset management focus. They similarly have very, very similar approaches documented for their particular industries as well. We need to, step 3, we need to motivate people, motivate and educate. Why do we need AEM? What do we need to do that, and how do we do it? And I notice the ALN does a lot of this as well. So there's not a dissimilar path here. Why are we going to do all this? Well, I need to improve myself, I need to improve my family, and I need to improve Australia. So why are we motivating and educating to do all those things? And governments, and when you talk to federal governments and state governments, one of the reasons asset management has some resonance with those, it's about developing these things called competitive advantage. So improving Australia, you need to deal directly with the issue of competitive advantage. Step 4, use conversations and conferences to motivate people and challenge. Challenge is an important aspect of motivation, not in a negative way, in a positive way. Challenge people. Work with government agencies. You can see PM&C there as Prime Minister and Cabinet. That's at a federal level. At a state level, it's Premier and Cabinet. And certainly one of we have people working and have over the years with people working in government, and it's really important to get to the senior leadership, particularly of the public service. That's where a lot of the sponsorship for these activities arises now, through that senior management, particularly at that Prime Minister and Cabinet and Premier and Cabinet level. Very important to have that influence at that level. And then we use the body of knowledge and the maturity assessments associated with that to highlight needed improvement and benefits that should accrue. And that's very much the focus of many government organisations around Australia now, is to do with the last bit I'm talking about. They might not always use the AIM Council body of knowledge, but they might use their own industry's body of knowledge or their own industry's maturity assessments. But there's certainly a desire around Australia now for people to get involved and measure and improve. That's a whole lot of information there, Jack. I'm sure there's lots of questions and comments. I do apologise for going over time for a few minutes, but I do get excited about these things occasionally. And I found it very difficult, honestly, to put this presentation together, because what do you talk about? There's so much you could talk about. I think I've hit the high points. I haven't hit the low points. Maybe we can talk about the low points later on. But hopefully that created some points to talk about.